The air in the Colorado high country was a blade, sharp and thin. Thomas Crow Feather moved through the aspen grove, his moccasins silent on the carpet of fallen leaves. Gold light filtered through the thinning canopy, dappling the forest floor in a shifting mosaic of shadow and sun. He was tracking a ghost, a mountain lion that had grown bold, its kills growing closer to the valley's homesteads. A phantom that left behind little more than the scent of blood on the wind and the deep, unnerving silence that followed its passage. He carried a Winchester, its stock worn smooth by his hands. But his truest weapons were his eyes and ears, senses honed by a lifetime spent reading the subtle language of the wild. A flicker of movement ahead, too small for the lion, caught his eye. He froze, melting into the shadow of a ponderosa pine. His heart, usually a steady drumbeat against his ribs, faltered. Through the trees, he saw her. Little Star. His daughter sat on a sun-warmed boulder, a charcoal stick clutched in her small fingers, her sketch pad resting on her knees. Her head was tilted, her focus absolute. She was drawing the very creature he hunted. The mountain lion lay 50 yards beyond her, stretched out on a high ledge, its tawny body relaxed, but alert tail twitching almost lazily. It was a magnificent, terrible thing, a confluence of muscle and predatory grace. It had not yet seen the child. A cold dread, colder than any winter wind, coiled in Thomas's gut. He raised the rifle, the metal icy against his cheek, lining up the sights on the cat's broad head. But a shot would send the sound echoing through the valley, a signal of his presence. Worse if he missed, if he only wounded it. He lowered the rifle slowly, his mind racing. He had taught her about predators, about the caution required to live in this place, where beauty and danger were two sides of the same coin. Her fearlessness, a trait inherited from her mother, was both his pride and his terror. He took a silent step, then another, circling to position himself between his daughter and the beast. The wind was in his favor, carrying his scent away from the ledge. He moved with a liquid grace that belied his size, a ghost in his own right. When he was 20 feet from her, he spoke, his voice a low whisper that was part of the forest, not an intrusion upon it. Little Star. She jumped, her charcoal stick skittering across the rock. Her wide, dark eyes, so like her mother's, flew to his face, a flash of guilt quickly replaced by wonder. "Papa, look. Isn't he beautiful?" she whispered, pointing with her chin toward the ledge. "He looks like the king of the whole mountain." Thomas did not look at the lion. His gaze was fixed on his daughter, the only thing in this world he could not bear to lose. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his hand gentle but firm on her shoulder. "He is a killer, daughter. He killed the Jensen's calf 2 nights ago." He was hungry, she said, her logic simple and profound. Everything has to eat. "And you are small and soft-skinned," Thomas replied, his voice rough, with a fear he could not hide. He pulled her up, tucking the sketch pad under his arm. "He would see you as an easy meal. Did you forget everything I taught you?" Her lower lip trembled. "I wasn't scared. I was quiet. He didn't even know I was here." "That is a chance we do not take." Thomas said, his grip on her shoulder tightening for a fraction of a second. "Ever." He turned her away from the ledge, away from the mesmerizing danger, and started walking back toward their cabin. He could feel the lion's eyes on their backs, a silent predatory weight. He did not look back. To show fear was to invite a challenge. They walked in silence for a time, the only sound the crunch of leaves under their feet. The confrontation had not been with the lion, but with the terrifying, untamable curiosity of his own child. He looked down at her, at the dark braids intertwined with beads Maria had painstakingly threaded years ago, and felt the familiar ache of his grief. Maria had understood this part of their daughter. She had nurtured it. Thomas only knew how to protect against its consequences. As their cabin came into view, a solid, defiant shape against the vastness of the mountains, they saw it. A stagecoach, looking impossibly fragile and out of place, was pulling away from their gate, leaving a cloud of dust and a lone figure standing beside a large trunk. It was a woman, her posture ramrod straight, her dark green traveling dress a stark slash of color against the muted autumn landscape. Little Star stopped her earlier transgression, forgotten. She looked from the woman to her father, her dark eyes filled with a sudden startling light. "Papa," she breathed, her voice filled with awe. "It's her." Thomas felt a new kind of dread settle over him. It's a lost traveler, that's all. But Little Star shook her head, a small, certain motion. "No. The chickadees have been talking about her all morning. They said a storm was coming, and so was she." She tugged on his hand, her excitement palpable. "She's the one." Victoria Ashworth gripped the worn leather of her travel bag, the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly tilted off its axis. The letter in her reticule had promised a prosperous ranch house, white-painted and welcoming. This was a hermit's refuge, a log cabin that seemed to have grown from the mountainside itself, hunkering under the shadow of the jagged peaks. The sun hammered the valley floor, baking the cracked earth until it shimmered like a mirage. And in the distance, the mountains clawed at a sapphire sky. This was a place of brutal, magnificent beauty. And she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The stagecoach was a dwindling speck on the horizon. The driver, a grizzled man named Murphy, had been apologetic, but firm. "Here's the address you gave me, miss. Can't take you no further. Roads are what they are." She had traveled for 8 days from Boston, fueled by a desperate hope that was now curdling into panic. The matrimonial advertisement from Mr. Jacob Mitchell had been her last resort, a lifeline thrown to a woman drowning in the polite ruin of her father's financial collapse. Now, standing before this monument to isolation, she feared the lifeline was a noose. The cabin door opened, and the man who emerged seemed as wild and untamed as the landscape. He was tall, his shoulders straining the fabric of a worn flannel shirt. Dark hair brushed his collar, and his skin was the color of burnished copper, weathered by sun and wind. But it was his eyes that held her captive, a startling, piercing green, the color of moss after a rain. They studied her with a weary caution that spoke of a deep and abiding distrust of the world. Blue-black tattoos, intricate patterns of birds and symbols coiled around his forearms, a language she could not read but understood as a mark of otherness. "You lost?" he asked. His voice was a low baritone, concise, practical, a tool meant for use, not adornment. Victoria straightened her spine, a lifetime of deportment lessons serving as armor. "I am Victoria Ashworth," she said, her voice betraying only a slight tremor. "I was sent here by the Colorado Matrimonial Service. I am to marry a Mr. Jacob Mitchell. This is the Broken Arrow Ranch, is it not?" A flicker of something pity, perhaps, or a grim amusement passed through his green eyes. "Name's Thomas Crow Feather," he said. The cadence of his speech was measured different from the clipped efficiency of Boston. "This isn't the Broken Arrow. That's 15 miles north. You're at my place. And I didn't send for a bride." The words struck her with physical force. She had burned every bridge sold, every keepsake. There was no going back. From behind the man's legs, a small face appeared. A girl of about 8 with braids of glossy black hair and enormous solemn eyes that seemed to see right through Victoria's carefully constructed composure. She was a miniature of the land itself, wild and beautiful and ancient. "The stage won't be back for a week," Thomas said, his tone softening slightly as he took in her predicament. A storm washed out the pass up north. You can shelter here, but I live quiet. I don't care for complications." Before Victoria could respond, the little girl stepped forward. She moved with an unchildlike grace, her beaded buckskin dress whispering against the ground. She reached out and touched the sleeve of Victoria's dress, her small fingers tracing the embroidery with a delicate curiosity. Then she looked up, her gaze direct and unnervingly perceptive. "Papa," she said, her voice soft as a moth's wing. "The hawk's flight this morning showed a storm coming from the north and a traveler coming from the east. It's her. The one I saw in the patterns of the frost on the window pane. The one with hair like a dying fire and eyes the color of a summer sky." Thomas's jaw tightened. He placed a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Little Star, we've talked about this. A stranger is a stranger. Miss Ashworth is lost. Don't go weaving stories." But the child Little Star was unshakable. She looked back at Victoria, her expression one of profound certainty. "I saw her coming when the leaves turned gold," she insisted, carrying sadness like a heavy pack. "But she brings medicine too. Medicine for a sickness in the heart." Victoria felt a strange stirring in her chest, a resonance with the child's poetic words. What kind of medicine? She whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. Little Star's solemn face broke into a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. "The kind that makes a family whole again," she said. "The kind that teaches a heart how to mend." A gust of wind swept down from the high peaks, whipping Victoria's hair across her face and carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine and coming snow. Thomas stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You better come inside," he said gruffly. "The cold comes on fast when the sun drops." He hefted her heavy trunk as if it were a child's toy and led the way into the cabin. The interior was a surprise. It was not the rough bachelor's hovel she might have expected. A fire blazed in a great stone hearth, casting a warm glow on the walls built of massive hand-hewn logs. The space was a harmonious blend of two worlds. A delicate china tea service sat on a shelf next to a hand-carved wooden bowl. Finely woven blankets, rich with geometric patterns, hung next to framed botanical prints. Above the mantel, a magnificent bow of polished wood rested beside a quiver of eagle-feathered arrows. The furniture was sturdy and handmade, built with an artisan's care. And one wall was lined with shelves overflowing with books, Shakespeare and Plato, alongside manuals on animal husbandry and treatises on native plants. Little Star took Victoria's hand, her small grip surprisingly strong. "You must be tired. Papa makes strong coffee. I'll get you a cup." Thomas moved with an economy of motion, adding a log to the fire, setting the coffee pot over the flames. He was a man comfortable in his own skin, at home in the silence. "Your daughter, she is very perceptive," Victoria said, sinking into a worn but comfortable chair by the fire. "She has her mother's gift," Thomas replied, and the subtle tightening around his eyes spoke of a deep, carefully managed pain. A gift for seeing the patterns and things others miss. "Where is her mother?" Victoria asked gently, already suspecting the answer. He stared into the flames for a long moment. "Maria died," he said, his voice flat, stripped of emotion. 2 winters ago. A fever. The snows were too deep to get to town. By the time the thaw came, it was too late." His knuckles whitened as he gripped his own cup. "Little Star hasn't been the same. She started talking more about the stories things tell her, the wind, the birds, the river. Some folks think it's strange. I've learned to listen." Little Star returned with a steaming mug, her movements careful. "Mama visits me in my dreams," she said, as if discussing the weather. "She told me you were coming. She said you would understand. about losing someone. About having your heart break so bad you think it might never beat right again. She said, "You know how it feels to forget how to laugh." Victoria's breath caught. How could this child see the hollow space inside her, the one carved out by her father's disgrace and her own shattered future? Thomas stood abruptly. "I'll get blankets for the spare room." But little Star shook her head. "She is where she's supposed to be, Papa. The river doesn't make mistakes about where it flows. It sent her to us." As Thomas prepared the small guest room, Victoria found her gaze drawn to a small, silver-framed photograph on the mantel. It was a woman with little Star's dark eyes and a smile that seemed to hold the warmth of the sun. Her arm was linked through Thomas's, and he was looking at her with an expression of such profound love that it made Victoria's heart ache. Maria. She was beautiful, a woman who had clearly bridged the two worlds so evident in this cabin. "Mama came from far away too," little Star said quietly, following her gaze. "Her people were Spanish, but she grew up near Papa's people. She said she never felt like she belonged in one place until she found him. She said the best wisdom comes from mixing different kinds of knowing together, like braiding sweetgrass with river willow." The evening passed in a strange, dreamlike state. Little Star chattered on describing the world outside the cabin with the precision of a naturalist, while Thomas remained largely silent, a watchful, steady presence. Victoria learned he had been educated at a mission school forced to learn Latin and European history, while his grandfather secretly taught him the medicinal properties of plants and the star charts of his Lakota ancestors. "They tried to make me choose," he said, his green eyes reflecting the firelight. "They didn't understand. A man isn't one thing or the other. He is the ground where his histories meet." When it was time for bed, little Star hugged Victoria tightly. "I'm glad you came," she whispered. "Papa keeps his smiles locked away. Maybe you have the key." The spare room was small but immaculate. A bed covered in soft furs, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and on the wall a simple wooden cross hung beside a delicate web-like dream catcher. Symbols of two faiths coexisting in peace. As Victoria changed, she thought of the man she was supposed to marry, Jacob Mitchell. His letters had been full of talk of commerce, of expanding his herd, of the practicalities of running a large enterprise. He had seemed solid, dependable. But she doubted his home contained the kind of soulful complexity she found here in this small cabin, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the valley. Lying under the heavy firs, listening to the wind sing its lonely song through the pines, Victoria felt a strange sense of homecoming. She had arrived lost, rejected, and terrified. But in the eyes of a solemn little girl and a sad, quiet man, she had found something she hadn't even known she was searching for, a place where a broken heart might just possibly learn how to mend. Dawn broke like a raw egg yolk, yellow and blood orange, spilling over the eastern peaks. Victoria awoke to the rhythmic crack of an axe splitting wood. Through the small window she saw Thomas, his movements a powerful, efficient ballet of motion. He worked with a focused intensity that seemed to be more than just the chore of stocking firewood. It was a meditation, a physical manifestation of some inner turmoil. Little Star sat on a nearby stump, carefully weaving dried grasses into a small basket, her presence a quiet counterpoint to her father's restless energy. Victoria, dressed in a practical wool dress, the deep blue a somber contrast to the fiery gold of the aspens outside. When she emerged into the main room, little Star was at the table setting out pottery plates painted with delicate geometric designs. "Good morning," the child said with a formal politeness that was charmingly at odds with her buckskin dress. "Papa made flapjacks. He says you might be hungry after your journey." Thomas entered an armload of split pine stacked high. The clean, sharp scent of it filled the cabin. "Morning, Miss Ashworth," he said, his tone polite but distant. He seemed more guarded than the night before. Sleep well." "Very well, thank you," she replied truthfully. The quiet of the mountains had been a balm. "I hope my presence isn't an imposition." "No imposition," he said, turning away to wash at the basin. "Little Star has been up since first light, making sure everything was just so. Haven't seen her this busy since—" He let the sentence hang unfinished. "Since her mother was alive." The words echoed in the space between them. Breakfast was a quiet affair. The flapjacks were light drizzled with a dark, rich honey that tasted of wildflowers. As they ate, Victoria learned more about the man, whose name was the cause of her current predicament. "Jacob Mitchell is ambitious," Thomas said, choosing his words carefully. "Bought the old Broken Arrow spread 5 years back. Runs a big operation. Thinks the whole valley should belong to him." There was a hard edge to his voice, a history of conflict that went unspoken. "He has a daughter?" Victoria asked, remembering the matrimonial advertisement. Thomas shook his head. "No, not that I know of. Why?" "The advertisement mentioned a daughter. It said he was seeking a wife to help raise her." Thomas frowned, a deep line forming between his brows. "That's strange. He's not a man who strikes me as the fatherly type." A seed of unease took root in Victoria's mind. A lie in a matrimonial advertisement was a profound betrayal, a deception at the very foundation of the arrangement. After the meal, Little Star was eager to give Victoria a tour of their small domain. "I want to show you Mama's medicine garden," she announced, "and the creek where the otters play." Thomas nodded his approval, but his eyes were troubled. "Just stay clear of the North Ridge. I saw fresh tracks this morning. Mitchell's men. They've been pushing their cattle onto my grazing land again." The garden, though touched by frost and neglect, still held the ghost of Maria's careful tending. Neat rows now overgrown with weeds showed where vegetables had grown. Patches of herbs still flourished, sage-thyme and lavender she recognized, but also plants with silvery leaves and strange star-shaped flowers she had never seen before. "This is Osha root," Little Star explained, pointing to a feathery plant. "Mama called it bear medicine. Good for coughs and for keeping bad spirits away." She spoke of each plant as if it were an old friend recounting the stories and uses Maria had taught her. "Mama said a garden is like a good family. All the different plants have to learn to live together, helping each other grow strong." As they worked, pulling weeds and turning over the soil in a small patch, Victoria felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. The physical labor was honest and satisfying. Here, her worth was not measured by her father's reputation or her marriage prospects, but by the work of her own 2 hands. From the cabin roof, the sound of hammering echoed across the yard. Thomas was mending shingles, preparing for the coming winter. "Papa can fix anything," Little Star said with fierce pride. "Mama used to say he had magic in his hands, the way he could make broken things whole again." Thomas climbed down later, his face streaked with sweat and grime. He looked from Victoria's dirt-smudged hands to the neatened patch of garden, a flicker of approval in his eyes. "Maria would have liked that," he said quietly. "She said working the earth helped keep a person's soul from getting tangled." The easy moment was broken by the sound of hoofbeats. 3 riders approached their movements, arrogant and loud. They stopped just outside the fence line, their horses churning the soft earth. The man in the lead was broad and coarse-featured, a shiny silver star pinned haphazardly to his vest. "Crow Feather," the man sneered. "Sheriff Barrows, just making my rounds." His eyes, small and mean, slid over to Victoria, lingering with an unpleasant familiarity. "Looks like you've got company. Didn't figure you for the social type." "State your business, Barrows." Thomas said, his voice dangerously low. He had moved almost unconsciously to stand slightly in front of Victoria and Little Star. Just a friendly warning. Barrows set his gaze, returning to Thomas. Mr. Mitchell is getting tired of your strays wandering onto his land. He finds any more of your mangy beasts mixing with his prime stock, he's going to start charging you for the privilege. My cattle know their own grazing land. Thomas set his body rigid. It's your boss who doesn't respect boundaries. Barrows spat a stream of tobacco juice near Thomas's feet. Mr. Mitchell owns most of this valley. The sooner you realize that, the easier it'll be for everyone. He's a man who gets what he wants. He gave Victoria another long, insolent look. Seems he's not the only one. He laughed a raw, ugly sound and wheeled his horse around, his men following suit. They galloped off, leaving a tense silence in their wake. He's not a real sheriff, Little Star whispered, clutching Victoria's hand. He's just one of Mr. Mitchell's men. Papa says he bought that star in a mail-order catalog. The encounter left a stain on the afternoon. The threat was no longer abstract. It had a face and a name. Victoria now understood that Thomas's conflict with Jacob Mitchell was not just a simple dispute over cattle. It was a struggle for survival. Mitchell was a predator of a different kind, one who used power and intimidation to devour the land and lives of others. That evening, the mood in the cabin was somber. The confrontation had brought the harsh realities of their world crashing in. As Little Star slept curled up on the hearth rug, Thomas finally spoke of the things he had held back. Mitchell has been trying to buy me out since he arrived, he said, staring into the fire. This land. My wife's people have lived in this valley for generations. The stream, the woods, the mountains, they're part of us. My deed is legal filed with the territory government. But that doesn't matter to a man like Mitchell. He wants it all. He picked up a small, intricately carved wooden bird from the mantel, a meadowlark. Maria's brother carved this. He was a miner. Smart. He found something on this land, a survey marker he thought was wrong. He started asking questions about old claims about the original boundaries of the Broken Arrow. He paused, his knuckles white around the small bird. He died in a mining accident. A support beam gave way. They called it a tragedy. I never believed it. The implication was chilling. Maria's brother had been silenced. Victoria felt a cold knot of fear. The man she had almost married was not just a liar and a bully. He was potentially a murderer. She reached into her reticule, and her fingers brushed against the cool metal of a locket. Inside was a miniature portrait of her father, Elias Ashworth, handsome and smiling, painted in the year before. He had supposedly died in a shipping accident, his body lost at sea. She had clung to this image of him, the benevolent father ignoring the whispers of his reckless business dealings, his dangerous gambles. Mitchell isn't his real name, Thomas said suddenly, his voice startling her. Murphy, the stage driver, told me once. Said the man who bought the Broken Arrow came from back east, looking to disappear. Paid in cash and asked no questions. A man running from something. Victoria's blood ran cold. She thought of the letter of introduction Mitchell had sent her, the elegant looping script. She had a few of her father's old business letters packed in her trunk, remnants of a life that no longer existed. A sudden, terrifying suspicion began to form in her mind, so monstrous she could barely give it shape. She looked at Thomas, at the profound grief and simmering anger in his face, and knew she could not keep her own secrets. Mr. Crow Feather, Thomas, there is something I must tell you. She told him about the discrepancies in the advertisement, the lie about the daughter. Then, her voice trembling, she told him about her own father, a man from Boston, a wealthy investor who had lost everything, a man who had faked his own death to escape disgrace and prosecution, a man who, in the portrait in her locket, bore a certain resemblance to the descriptions she had heard of the reclusive Jacob Mitchell. Thomas listened, his expression unreadable stone. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the rising howl of the wind outside. A storm was coming. "We need to see a picture of this," Mitchell Thomas said at last, his voice grim. "There's a photographer in town. He did a portrait of all the big ranchers for the territorial newspaper last year. When this storm passes, we ride to town." The cabin, which had felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a fortress under siege. The enemy was no longer just a greedy rancher, but a ghost from Victoria's own past, a man tied to her by blood, and to Thomas by a history of violence and death. The coming blizzard was more than just weather. It was a curtain falling, trapping them all on a stage where a final terrible act was about to play out. The storm arrived, not with a roar, but with a whisper. The sky, which had been a bruised purple, turned a flat, dead gray. The wind died, and a profound, expectant silence fell over the valley. Then the first snowflakes began to drift down, large and deliberate like ash from a distant fire. "Get the animals secured," Thomas said, his voice taut. "This is going to be a bad one." They worked with a frantic, silent efficiency. Victoria helped Little Star scatter extra feed for the chickens and ensure their coop was latched tight. Thomas led their 2 horses into the small, sturdy barn, checking the walls for any drafts. The air grew colder by the minute, a biting, invasive cold that seeped through their coats and numbed their fingers. Inside the cabin, they stacked firewood by the hearth until it reached the ceiling. Victoria inventoried their food supplies, sacks of flour and beans, jars of preserved vegetables, smoked venison hanging from the rafters. They had enough to last for months, if need be. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. By late afternoon, the world outside had vanished. The snow was no longer drifting. It was a solid, blinding curtain of white, driven by a wind that shrieked around the corners of the cabin like a tormented spirit. The small structure groaned under the assault, a ship tossed on a frozen sea. They were utterly, completely cut off. The forced intimacy created a strange new dynamic. Jacob Mitchell. The name felt like a lie on her tongue, was an oppressive presence. The truth of his identity hovered in the air between Victoria and Thomas, an unspoken secret that charged every glance, every word. The old one said a blizzard is the breath of the world cleaning itself. Little Star said, her face pressed against a frosted window pane. It blows away everything that is old and rotten to make way for new life. As night fell, the storm's fury intensified. Thomas stood by the door, listening. Not just to the wind, but to something else. "Someone's out there," he said, his hand moving instinctively to the Winchester on the mantel. "No one could survive in this," Victoria protested, her heart hammering. "Someone desperate might try." And then they heard it, a faint rhythmic thudding, almost lost in the howl of the wind. The sound of an axe. It came from the direction of the barn. A raw animal panic seized Victoria. The barn held their horses, their winter hay, their survival. A fire. Thomas grabbed a heavy coat and the rifle. "Stay here. Bar the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me." He looked at Victoria, his green eyes blazing with a fierce protective light. "Keep her safe." He disappeared into the swirling vortex of white. Victoria's hands trembled as she slid the heavy wooden bar across the door. She pulled Little Star away from the windows, her mind racing. This was no random act. It was an attack. Mitchell, or Elias, her father, was using the storm as cover. He must have realized his deception was unraveling. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The sound of chopping stopped, replaced by an angry shout, then another. A gunshot cracked through the storm, sharp and definitive, followed by a second. Victoria held her breath, straining to hear, but there was only the wind. "Papa," little Star whispered, her small body trembling. Victoria held her tight. "He's all right. He's strong." She tried to make her voice steady, a rock for the child to cling to, even as her own fear threatened to drown her. Then a new sound, a scraping at the back window. Victoria's blood turned to ice. They weren't just at the barn, they were trying to get in. She grabbed a heavy iron poker from the hearth, her knuckles white. She was no longer the frightened woman from Boston. She was a protector. This was her home now. These were her people. A face appeared at the window, one of Barrow's men, his features twisted into a grotesque leer. The glass rattled as he pried at the frame. Little Star screamed. Acting on pure instinct, Victoria swung the poker, shattering the window pane. A blast of icy wind and snow exploded into the room. The man cursed, pulling back a dark gash on his cheek. But the breach was made. He would be back, and he wouldn't be alone. Victoria dragged a heavy bookshelf in front of the broken window, its contents crashing to the floor. It was a flimsy barricade, but it would buy them time. The front door rattled, the heavy bars straining against the wood. "Thomas," a voice yelled from outside. "I know you're in there, and I know who you've got with you." It was him, her father. The voice was distorted by the wind, but she knew it. "Send out my daughter, Thomas. This doesn't have to get ugly." "Don't listen to him," little Star cried, her face buried in Victoria's dress. "He smells of lies and rot." Suddenly, the bar on the front door splintered with a sickening crack. The door flew open, and Jacob Mitchell, Elias Ashworth, stood framed in the doorway, the blizzard raging behind him. He was not the handsome man from the locket. His face was gaunt, his eyes burning with a desperate wild fire. Barrows and another man stood behind him, their guns drawn. "Victoria," he said, his voice a mockery of paternal affection. "I've come to take you home." "This is my home," she shot back, standing defiantly between him and little Star, the poker held like a sword. Elias's smile was a chilling slash in his pale face. "Don't be foolish. You're with him, aren't you? The half-breed who killed Maria's brother." The world seemed to stop, what Victoria whispered. "Oh, didn't he tell you?" Elias said, stepping into the room, snow melting on his shoulders. He was there. The only other man in the mine when the accident happened. He wanted this land, the silver I knew was here. He killed for it. Victoria looked from her father's triumphant, twisted face to the memory of Thomas's honest grief. She knew with every fiber of her being that it was a lie. A monstrous, self-serving lie. "You're the killer," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "You killed him because he discovered who you are. He discovered what you stole." Elias's face contorted with fury. He was a meddling fool just like his brother-in-law. "Now step aside." He lunged for her. But at that moment, a dark shape filled the broken doorway behind him. Thomas. His face was a mask of cold fury, a bleeding cut on his temple. But his eyes were locked on Elias. He held the Winchester leveled at the center of Elias's chest. Barrows and the other man had not come back with him from the barn. "It's over, Ashworth," Thomas said, his voice like the scraping of stone on stone. Elias spun around, his own pistol appearing in his hand as if by magic. He grabbed Victoria, pulling her in front of him as a shield. The cold metal of the gun barrel pressed against her temple. "You won't shoot me, Crowfeather," Elias hissed. "Not when it means killing your precious new bride." "Papa, don't," little Star screamed. Thomas's face was agonized. He could not take the shot. Victoria's mind raced a frantic search for an escape. Her father's grip was like iron. His body was pressed against hers, and through the thick wool of his coat, she could feel the hard rectangular shape of something in his inner pocket. A book, a wallet. "You were always a disappointment," Victoria Elias whispered in her ear, his breath foul. "Weak like your mother. But you're useful now." He began to back toward the door, dragging her with him. In that moment of utter desperation, an idea born of Little Star's stories bloomed in Victoria's mind. She stomped down hard on his instep with the heel of her boot. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She twisted, jamming her elbow into his ribs, and as he staggered back, her hand shot inside his coat, her fingers closing around the object in his pocket. It was a metal flask. She pulled it free and threw it with all her strength, not at Thomas, but into the roaring fire in the hearth. The explosion was deafening. The flask of whiskey erupted in a ball of blue and orange flame, sending a shower of burning embers and hot liquid across the room. Elias screamed, his coat catching fire, and instinctively threw himself away from the flames, away from Victoria. In that instant, Thomas fired. The rifle's report was like a thunderclap inside the cabin. Elias Ashworth crumpled to the floor, his face a mask of shock, the life fading from his mad eyes. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the spreading fire and the undiminished howl of the storm outside. Victoria rushed to Little Star, pulling her into a protective embrace as Thomas moved swiftly to beat out the flames with a heavy blanket. The immediate danger was over, but the storm both inside and out was far from finished. Spring came to the high country, not as a gentle awakening, but as a violent, messy birth. The snowpack, which had held the valley in a white fist for 5 long months, retreated grudgingly, melting into torrential streams that scoured the land and turned the valley floor into a sea of mud. But with the thaw came life. Patches of green appeared on the hillsides, and the aspens, skeletal and gray, all winter began to bud with a color so vibrant it hurt the eyes. The cabin had survived, as had its inhabitants. They had emerged from the long, dark winter into the brilliant spring sunshine changed. The blizzard had not broken them. It had forged them into something new, something stronger. Thomas's wound had healed, leaving a faint scar on his temple, a physical reminder of the night they had fought for their lives. The true healing, however, was deeper. The shadows that had haunted his eyes for 2 years had begun to recede, replaced by a quiet, steady light. The revelation of Elias Ashworth's identity and his crimes had sent shockwaves through the territory. When the thaw allowed, the town marshal, a man of quiet integrity and a friend to Thomas, had come to take statements. The bodies of Barrows and his man were found in the snow near the burned-out shell of the barn. Elias Ashworth's confession, witnessed by Victoria, was enough to close the book on the death of Maria's brother. The Broken Arrow Ranch fell into the hands of the territorial government, its future uncertain, its legacy of greed and violence finally ended. One bright morning in May, Thomas came to Victoria, where she was kneeling in Maria's garden. She had spent weeks reviving it, her hands in the rich, dark earth, a constant source of solace and hope. She was carefully planting seeds she had brought from Boston lavender and rose, alongside the native bee balm and yarrow that Little Star had helped her identify. It felt right, blending the old with the new, her past with her future. Thomas knelt beside her, his presence warm and solid. He didn't speak for a moment, just watched her hands as she gently pressed soil over a seed. Then he held out a folded piece of paper. "The marshal brought this from town," he said. Victoria unfolded it. It was a new deed to the land, their land. At the bottom, 2 names were written in the clerk's official script: Thomas Crow Feather and Victoria Ashworth Crow Feather. Her breath caught. They had been married by a traveling preacher a month earlier, a simple ceremony on the porch of the cabin with little Star as their only witness. But this document of partnership felt even more profound. "It's ours," he said simply, "together." She looked up at him, her heart so full it felt as though it might burst. The love she felt for this man was as vast and as wild as the mountains that surrounded them. It was a love built not on romantic fantasy, but on shared hardship, mutual respect, and the quiet, everyday work of building a life. Little Star came running from the creek bed, her hands cupped carefully. "Look," she cried, her face alight with discovery. She opened her hands to reveal a stone smooth and gray on the outside. "Papa, can you open it?" Thomas took the stone and, with a practiced tap of a small hammer, split it in two. The inside was a hollow cavern of glittering amethyst-colored crystals. A geode, breathtakingly beautiful and utterly worthless. Elias Ashworth had killed a man and terrorized a valley for the promise of silver, never understanding that the land's true treasure could not be mined or weighed. It was in the sparkling crystals of a worthless rock, in the scent of a new garden, in the sound of a child's laughter echoing on the clean mountain air. Victoria took one half of the geode, Thomas the other. Little Star looked from one to the other, her smile wide and joyous. The sickness in the heart had been healed. The family once broken was whole again. The future stretched before them unknown and challenging. But they would face it as they had faced the blizzard together.